Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks very much to the organisers for this invitation. Before I start, I'd just like to recognise the traditional owners who themselves have lived through major climate change through the past ice age and the deglaciation following that. So what I'm just going to cover today briefly is, a bit too fast there, is just a little bit about climate change and global agriculture. It's really only scratching the surface. I'm doing this on behalf of Peter Heyman from SARDI in South Australia and Scott Chapman from CSIRO, but drawing on the work of many of my colleagues in doing so. So one of the first things I usually start conversations with is actually you start from the known. So what do we actually know about climate and its impacts on agriculture and food systems and value chains? And so there's a whole stack which we can actually say with a great deal of certainty that climate is actually a major driver of agriculture here in Australia and globally. It affects all of those things that are listed there, the choice of production systems, the soil types which are preferred, production potential and quality, management systems which are adopted, input costs, prices and trade. So for example, global trade in grains like wheat is massively affected by the state of El Nino, whether it's a La Nina or an El Nino. Natural resource management, human health and social fabric, for example, suicide rates of farmers in Australia are linked to climate and climate change. There's businesses along the value chain and regional economies which are influenced by climate. And we can say this because we know this from experience. And it follows that if the climate changes, then all of these things are going to be impacted. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. And so what we want to do is sort of understand a bit more about what these changes may be and what we can do about them. So as Susan mentioned in the introduction, carbon dioxide levels are going up. If you look back over almost 1 million years over the glaciations, the cold periods, which are the bottom of these, the wiggly line, and the tops, which are the interglacials, the warm bits, you can see that over all of those different glaciations, the top levels of carbon dioxide are around about 280 or 300 parts per million. As Susan mentioned, we're actually now exceeding 400 parts per million, and we're heading up at current trajectories to the top of that graph towards 900 parts per million. If the Paris Agreement is successful, we actually may stop about halfway up that graph, about 500 parts per million. And so that's the key driver of this whole issue. But it's really important too for agriculture because carbon dioxide actually is critical, as we'd all know from photosynthesis, it's critical for plant growth. And so if you increase carbon dioxide levels, it makes plants more water efficient, more light efficient, more nitrogen efficient. So in the last 100 years, we've probably already got about an 8% kick in terms of yield from the CO2 increases that have already happened, and probably another 20% if we go on the same trajectory we are having now. So that's a really important thing associated with this issue. CO2 is rising. Can we actually get a free kick in terms of our agricultural production from that? So global temperature, it's been known for a long time that carbon dioxide is linked to temperature. It goes back to 1842. In 1895, there was a study which actually did this linkage. So it's not news. We've actually known about this for a long time. So it's not surprising carbon dioxide levels go up, global temperature goes up. You can see from this graph that it's going up pretty steadily since the 70s. Last year was the hottest year on record by a record margin. The whole 12 months, the last 12 months, every month in the last 12 months has been a record for that month in terms of the record. So, you know, it was record April, record March, record February, etc. So this is really significant change, and it's happening already, and it's not linear, it's somewhat exponential. And it's highly unlikely that this would have happened in the absence of human influence. So in fact, probably less than a 1 in 100,000 chance that we'd actually see this temperature increase in the absence of human influence through greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not just the average temperatures, but temperature extremes. So this is already happening, work of James Hansen. So roughly, the area which is now being affected by extremes in any given year is about an order of magnitude greater than the historical. And if you look at the Australian situation, now 100% of Australia is experiencing what would be considered extreme temperatures historically in the top 10% of years. So there is no escape, it's happening everywhere. And maybe Rob will mention some of this subsequently. And it's not just that the extremes are increasing the frequency of them, but they're coming earlier. So if you look, say, at Australia's wheat belt, in the northern part of that wheat belt, the first really hot day, greater than 35 degrees, is coming 3 weeks earlier now than it did before. So the period over which these extremes is happening is also increasing. And rainfall's changing. This is work of David Stevens and colleagues. On the left-hand side, it's the historical sort of zonation of rainfall, and what we can see already in the last 15 years or so is that that's effectively moving south. So the tropics are moving into the temperate zone. And it's also rainfall changes, so depending on where you are, in the southwest and the southeast, rainfall has gone down. In the northwest, it tends to have gone up a little bit. But as well as those changes in rainfall averages, we're seeing changes in rainfall intensity, essentially a really important driver of degradation, soil erosion, dryland salinity. And that's been increasing progressively across Australia and across other parts of the world, leading to increased damage in agricultural systems. And in some places, drought measures are increasing as well. So depending on how you measure this, we've seen increases in drought in various places. So all of these things can actually be a concern in terms of our existing systems. Now, in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the last assessment report, colleagues and I, we did a meta-analysis of what the evidence is for these changes already having impacted on growth rates of our major crops globally. So and this essentially is just saying that particularly for wheat and for maize, climate change is already pulling down on that growth rate. So we're getting growth rates which are probably about 2% per decade less than they would otherwise be in the absence of climate change. And so this is not looking to the future, this is what's already happening. So climate change is already biting for some of our major crops. And that mightn't sound much, 2% per decade, but you multiply that over a few decades, 3 or 4 decades, and that's actually could feed about 500 million people in the absence of climate change. So we're looking at non-trivial impacts. So as a result of all of those sorts of changes which are going on, and I could have presented a lot more, of course, but it seems to me that we need to think about reframing climate risk management. So just like ASIC, the Securities Investment Commission, says past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance, in terms of agricultural risk management, we need to now think about the past climate is no longer a reliable indicator of the future climate. We need to reframe the information, the data on which we base risk and opportunity. And because agriculture is fundamentally about matching what you do with the environment in which you operate, so that's the climate environment, the financial, technological, social environment, if you don't match your genetics, your management, your strategy to the climate of the time, you will either underperform or you will incur unnecessary risk. And neither of those are things that are desirable from an agribusiness point of view. So moving with the times and taking on board climate and climate changes is going to be increasingly core business, in my view, for agriculture. Now, how do we actually go about sort of thinking about this? This is a schematic produced by Peter Heyman and colleagues, where he starts to think about how we actually might think about and deal with possible futures given the uncertainty associated with climate change. So he categorises as remembering the future and modelling the future, visiting the future and preparing the future. So just to expand on that, so sort of remembering the future is looking backwards and seeing, for example, what droughts people have experienced and actually saying, well, can we learn from those droughts in ways that allow us to manage future droughts more effectively? And we also can use spatial analogues. So it's actually saying, well, if it's going to get hotter and drier, can we actually go to a place which is hotter and drier than where we're currently operating and see how risk management is dealt with there, look at the farming systems, understand the strategies that are used in that, and then bring those ideas back to your own location to try them out. And there's also sort of modelling the future, which is the top bar, which is thinking about climate change projections from global climate models and similar sources. So when you look at those sort of results, this is a graph from the IPCC. The sort of greyed out area on the left is the historical temperature across Australia. The red and blue bars or graphs on the right is temperature change with a low emissions scenario in the blue and a high emissions scenario in the red. A 2 degree sort of change, which is the upper part of the blue bar, is probably manageable within our systems. We've got analogues for quite a few places in 2 degrees, so agriculture can happen in that sort of environment, but a 4, 5, 6 degree is outside the envelope of our past experience. So there's areas where we can probably manage and have effective adaptations within our current systems and values, and there's probably climate futures where it will become very difficult. And we can also look at that and integrate that temperature change with the rainfall change and come up with things like runoff maps. Again, this is from the IPCC. It's the median estimate, not the best or the worst estimates, of runoff change per degree warming. So if you look down at the southwest of WA, 25% per degree. So that means if we actually manage to achieve the Paris targets, which is a 2 degree increase, it's looking at a 50% reduction in average runoff in that region. In Eastern Australia, it's a little bit less. Northern Australia, not necessarily much change. But the important thing here is that even though these look grim, they actually may be understatements of the risk. So if we go across to Perth, and look at the inflow of Perth dams, what historically was around about 350 gigalitres per annum coming into those dams, last year was 11. And that was typical of the previous handful of years. So we've gone from like 300 and something down to a dozen. And that's already happened. It grossly exceeds the sort of projections that are indicated here. And likewise in the Murray-Darling, we've already seen in some years runoff levels which are indicative of 2050 or 2070 scenarios rather than 2015 or 2016 scenarios. But the bit down the bottom is where I'm going to focus most of the talk now, and that's about preparing for the future, developing adaptation options, building adaptive capacity, and thinking about better adoption paths for adaptation options as part of good risk management in businesses. So what I'm going to use as a device here just to sort of talk about this is a risk return sort of frontier approach. So if on the bottom of these diagrams, there's the risk associated with particular decisions. On the side, it's productivity or profit, or it could be gross margin, so one of those sorts of measures. And typically, you have a trade-off. So if you want to be more profitable, you incur some additional risk. And the shape of these curves will, of course, differ, but this is just a demonstration. And now what our agricultural technology has done in the past and been incredibly successful at doing is continuously pushing out that frontier. So it's actually pushing that frontier up and out so that for a given level of risk, you actually have higher productivity. And on average, ABARES tells us on average across several decades, that's actually been about 2% per year up to year 2000. But subsequent to that, that's actually dropped to 0.4%. And these are climate adjusted numbers, so they've already taken into account the fact that we're in the millennium drought during part of that post-2000 period. And if we didn't have that climate adjustment in, those numbers would actually look a lot worse than they do. But this is actually really important because if you actually have a slowdown in pushing out that frontier, it has impacts all the way along the value chain in terms of the growth in those systems and the ability to deal with growing issues such as terms of trade. So that's sort of like the sort of expansion of the risk-return frontier is what we're trying to do. And there's ways of doing that. So a climate example of that is, and this again comes from work in South Australia, is if you actually say look at the risk-return frontier for a top dressing of nitrogen in wheat, is you get the black line, so that's not taking any climate forecasting into account, and the blue line is where you actually take seasonal forecasting into account. So adding that extra piece of information to the decision making pushes out that risk-return frontier. So it's actually what you want to do. So, and Rob might talk a little bit about these sorts of forecasts subsequently. So that's an example of how information and technology and data can actually change that risk-return frontier in positive ways. The trouble with climate change, particularly across southern Australia, is that it's going to operate in different ways. It's actually going to pull that frontier down. So as it gets hotter and drier, more variable, more intense rainfall, similar things, that frontier is probably going to be pulled down. So for any given risk level, your productivity is going to be higher, or for any given productivity level, your risk level is actually going to be higher under climate change. So So this idea is actually a really fundamental one. It's about the sort of the expansion associated with technology and the pull down associated with climate change, at least in southern Australia. And so we've already got problems in terms of that expansion, and climate change is just going to make that harder and harder over time. Now, it's only part of the picture. So, for example, yesterday we heard some really inspiring talks about often people at that frontier, people who are, or whether it's oyster farmers or grain growers, using really high-tech systems to actually push that frontier out. So in the case of the oysters, it's a 5% reduction in labour. Inputs was a number I seem to remember. And so it's incremental pushing out of that frontier. But there's many, many farmers, as David Williams said yesterday, that are actually operating well below that optimum. So they're not actually responding effectively to the current environments, let alone climate change. And so one of the really big tasks, of course, is actually how do you move the majority of farmers up towards that frontier, and how effective is that going to be in terms of increasing productivity? Now, when we actually look at that, this is work of Zvi Hockman down in the Wimmera. This shows the yield gap, the difference between actual yields on farm and the potential yields associated with it's a water efficiency measure over time. And what you can see from this graph is that about 20 years ago, there was roughly a 3-tonne yield gap on average, and it's shrunk because of improved practices down to about a 1 tonne a hectare yield gap. And if the trend keeps on going, it'll only be a few years before we're pretty much at the margins, at the frontier for these farmers in this location. And when you actually get to that 0 point, you have nowhere to go unless you actually make really significant changes to your system. And so just closing up that frontier is really, really important and really useful, but it will only take you so far. And so the question is, how can we deal with that under climate change? So when we've actually talked with farmers about this, we go out and engage with farmers and we talk about different scenarios of climate change. And I don't expect you to read this slide, but basically when you have a discussion with these groups, you talk about what are specific changes in climate, how is that going to impact on their production system, what are the adaptation responses that they can take to that, and what are the technologies that they need, new or improved technologies that they need to actually deal with climate changes. So I'll just get that bottom set of boxes and just pull them together into a slide like this. And so when you collapse this plus other information, one of the standard things that comes out from discussion is precision everything. So precision cropping, precision grazing, precision horticulture, precision viticulture. But linked strongly to climate. So you actually have climate as part of that. It's not just about spatial information, it's spatial plus climate information. So it's a spatial temporal combination there. Farmers often also want different genetics. So they often want super fast crops for dealing with climate change, heat and drought resistant for obvious reasons, but also CO2 responsive crops. So when we actually look globally at the genetics of crops and the material, is that we've actually been breeding crops that aren't particularly responsive to elevated carbon dioxide. So we've actually been breeding crops that don't get that free kick from that elevated CO2. So there's a yield potential just simply by building in CO2 responsiveness more effectively into our crops. And then there's sort of more adventurous options such as epigenetic switching for flexibility. I was exploring this with people in Cairo when I was running the climate adaptation flagship. So an idea there would be, once you actually get your seed into the ground, if you're doing dryland cropping, there's only very limited options that you have for management response until harvest time. But this was an idea which was saying, okay, well, if you actually start that seed and you actually start to actually get a really bad year, can you actually switch that to a lower tiller number mode? Or if it's a really good year, can you actually switch that to a high tiller number mode? So can you actually start to design epigenetics so that it actually flips the type of crop depending on the type of year as it unfolds? So starting to think about much more adventurous ways of building in genetics that are climate responsive rather than just fixed ones. And obviously, given that map that I showed you before about runoff across Australia, water and water management is going to become much more crucial. So every drop will count. And it's not just for farmers, but all the other water users in the system. And there are ways, John Manners showed up techniques with polymers yesterday, so either conserving water or moving water at the sort of metre scale within fields to actually maximise production and also minimise things like drainage as well. And obviously having as toolkits herbicides that actually can be used to maintain zero till is going to be crucial in terms of future systems. And as Ros Harvey mentioned yesterday, much, much better decision support systems than we tend to have had in the past, which are actually co-produced between producers and researchers and industry bodies, which are linked to a changing climate. So they don't take that 100-year view of risk, but take a much more insightful, moving window view of risk. And so actually starting to have decision support, which is actually still risk-based, but much more data-rich in terms of the climate information that it takes into account, encouraging flexibility, encouraging the development of the heuristics that Tony Fisher mentioned yesterday, but also being able to be used in ways that enhance the strategic decision-making of farmers. And of course there's water use sufficiency, sensors, delivery and policy, which is Australia often does very well according to our sort of competitors overseas. We're often seen as poster children of water policy change. But even so, we've still got really significant issues now, and those probably will increase in the future. But when you actually look at most of those things and the sorts of technologies that were talked about yesterday, they tend to focus on changing the existing system. So it's making the existing system a little bit more efficient and pushing that system up towards the frontier. So it's all about incremental change, and it's incredibly valuable. I'm not putting it down, but it's just saying it tends to lock people into saying, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm a wheat farmer and I would just farm that wheat a little bit more efficiently using that technology consistently to push up against that frontier. But it doesn't necessarily help with strategic or structural changes within the industry. And that's one of the three forms or sources of growth in terms of industry productivity. And so the question is, how can things like big data and those sorts of really detailed technologies actually start to help much more effectively in terms of strategic thinking and structural changes within industry? And the last thing I've got on this slide is just a dot point on emission reduction. That's called mitigation in the climate domain. And John Manners put up a couple of slides, so I won't cover this in such detail, except to say that there are many ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the farming sector. So there's changing genetics or feed types for livestock, improving the productivity of those livestock so they reduce the emissions per unit product. In crop systems, it's becoming more efficient in terms of nitrogen usage, which reduces your nitrous oxide emissions. You can store soil organic matter under an effective management, at least a little bit and for some of the time. And as John Manners said, you can actually store carbon across landscapes by growing trees or use biofuels to substitute for fossil fuels. I would actually have a bit of a difference with John's view of that, with large areas of Australia being converted to carbon farming rather than food farming. Because I think if you actually just look at the basic energy system, is that if you actually use a hectare of land for putting up solar photovoltaics, you'll probably produce about 20 times more energy than if you use that same hectare of land for biofuels. And if you actually want to substitute for fossil fuels, increasingly as we go more electrified, we will actually see photovoltaics as a source of electricity, which is actually fundamental to our transport systems and similar things. So rather than thinking about future carbon farming and biofuels, I would actually think you need to think about become energy farmers and thinking about ways in which you can have the legislative changes that allow you to partner with people like urban investors to actually have really low risk and really, really high return land use options, far exceed anything you'll be able to produce from agriculture currently. And of course, there's lots of talk about big data. So a couple of mentions here in terms of climate adaptation. So a lot of the focus has been on UAVs, but we shouldn't forget that there's near real-time satellites coming on board. So this Planet.com bunch over in the US is actually putting up fleets of micro-satellites which have global coverage daily at 3 to 5 metre resolution. So Scott Chapman calls this the drone killer. You won't need drones when you've actually got access to this sort of data. Obviously, UAVs do have their uses, and I think particularly in terms of crop breeding. So actually, using that information, rapid phenotyping, to actually link that information into simulation models, which speed up crop development for things like drought resistance and heat resistance. And there's opportunities, I think, to think big about how you use farmers as experimenters in big data breeding programs. So companies working with the seed providers, using specified seeds, specified farming prescriptions, recipes as it were, so that those farmers can go out there, and the number of site by gene by environment combinations, by year combinations just explodes. And so you have a huge amount more data to actually play with and to actually accelerate those breeding programs. But there are emerging data ownership issues, so farmers aren't necessarily willing to hand over the data from their precision ag systems to these people. So you actually have to deal with those sorts of issues at the same time. Now, as I mentioned before, one way of characterising climate change is essentially it's a technology push versus a climate change pull, and so we've actually gone out, Peter Heyman and others have gone out down in South Australia to say, okay, well, how do these play out in the farmer's view? How does the technology balance out against climate change? And this was particularly in the context of Goyder's line, which is a historic line drawn in the 1870s, and that's the black line on the map. And so the question was, how will climate change alter the sort of, in a sense, the location of that line, and also the sort of risk management and productivity situation across a transect going down from Ururu at Goyder's line at that point. And essentially these farmers said, well, under those climate scenarios, I think it was up to 2030, that line may actually come down as far as Clare. And if you actually know that part of South Australia, Clare is great wine growing country. It's really nice, very high productive country. And the farmers were saying that's what climate change may do to their backyard. So the competing interest was about how will technology change. So in the absence of climate change, how would technology change that frontier of cropping in South Australia? And they were saying that probably on past trends, it would actually push that cropping area, viable cropping, up towards Hawker, towards Wilpena Pound, into the desert area. And the net effect of the two would be still negative. So climate change in the long term will win against technology change, was the view of these farmers. So there's positives and there's negatives, but net it's going to be problematic for the farmers in that region. But I was thinking about a lot of the talks yesterday, and a lot of them focused on the hard technologies. But I think in this issue, as with many others, you actually really have to focus also on the soft technologies, the ones that actually interact with humans and human decision making. So I heard yesterday a comment that it's all about the data. Well, I actually disagree. I think it's all about strategic decision making, and the data and the tech is just one component into that. The innovation is the means, it's not the end. So we actually need to ensure that we have social technologies which focus on the end, the values and the strategies that meet those values of our farming colleagues. And I think this is really important because farmers are different in terms of climate change from the rest of Australia. So across Australia, about 8% of people say that climate change is not happening, full stop. But in the farming community, it's 34%. So there's a 4 times overrepresentation in terms of climate skepticism in the farming community and in rural communities than there are across the Australian population as a whole. And the proportion of farmers who say that yes, it's happening and it's due to human influence is actually about half the population average. So you've got a lot more climate deniers and a lot more climate change believers, if you want to use that terminology. And so it's really important to actually start to understand how can you actually roll out adoption strategies given that scepticism, given those attitudinal changes or differences. And part of that picture, I think, is addressing the social, cultural, and institutional norms which tend to focus people on what they're doing now rather than what they could do to actually meet their values and their aspirations. And as a result, it tends to focus on incremental change only, including through the sorts of innovations we saw yesterday. So it narrows the focus onto sort of incremental change and incremental yield improvement to that risk-return frontier rather than completely redesigning that. So I'm not saying that you have to redesign that, but what I'm saying is that as you think about climate change, you need to think more broadly about your options than just fine-tuning what you're doing now and thinking about much more structural and systemic transformational options. And so one of the questions is, how can we actually start to use our understanding of agricultural systems to actually start to develop things like risk-neutral adaptation experiments for the farming community so that they can start to adopt these sorts of changes with confidence. Just one more slide, Susan. It's just over, but it's about, I'll finish with 1 minute over. And of course, it's not just about what happens on farms, it's about what happens across food chains. And we've been working with some of the largest corporations globally in terms of understanding food chains and climate disruptions to those. So existing climate variability and trends and future change. And we've worked pretty successfully with these things. So for one of those corporations, it actually resulted in a significant structural change in how they do their business. For another corporation, it resulted in significant simplification of their supply chain to actually reduce climate risks. It pays off now, and they're thinking it will pay off in the future. So in summary, the global climate is changing, and more change is coming our way. These sort of changes are going to have pervasive impacts on agriculture. It's going to affect pretty much everything, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Technology improvement is already lagging, and climate change will probably make that lag further behind where we would like it to be. And so we actually do need more effective research and development. We do need a boost in that technology. We do need a boost in the social technologies which actually support change as well. If we're to stay ahead of climate change and be effective in terms of managing our land and managing our futures, we need to do this. We need to have more effective R&D which links the researchers, the farmers and the policymakers in co-design, co-production type ways. We've heard that earlier today from the young farmers. They actually want a say in what R&D gets done. There's a huge range of adaptation options possible, and many are very similar or just extensions of what we're already doing. But most of them have an extra tweak. There's an extra element to them which needs to be thought of in terms of climate change so that they're actually suited not only for the environment now, but also for the environment we're going to experience over the next decade or two. And lastly, I think it's really important to think about reframing climate adaptation as part of innovation, Innovation Australia, the exciting times we live in. And seeing it not as a problem, but seeing it as a source of advantage which actually drives innovative, information-rich agricultural systems that fit us well for an uncertain future. Thank you.